Juan Pedro Mora from the Pacific Coast of Canada, bringing you Pacific.ca. This time, we feature Gary Cristall, one of the organizers of the 2012 World Peace Forum. He reviews the historical legacies of political regimes in South America. Here is Gary.
What does Bolivarian revolution mean today? And what is going on in South America? South America is interesting. At one point I lived there, and for the first time in 40 years I was back there in the spring. It was fascinating to see how things that have changed and things that haven't. It is the only part of the world, with the exception perhaps of Nepal and a couple of other places, where socialism is being considered as an active option by millions of people. If you go wandering around Europe today and talk about that, people look at you piteously, as if you'd somehow gone to sleep in 1968 and just woken up. And in fact, there's a movie about that, of a woman that this happened to in East Germany, etc. But in Latin America, this is considered an option. The notion of socialism, the fact that there are governments, that there are millions of people that can be mobilized around the banner of socialism. But of course, what does that mean? And that we'll look at a little bit, because it's a little bit like Leon Trotsky once said of Norman Thomas, the American Socialist Party leader, said when he calls himself a socialist, it's the result of a misunderstanding. And to some degree, we can see that the term socialism is being used by a variety of people in a variety of situations across South America, and most of these people agree on very little. One thing that is interesting in terms of historical legacies is the historical legacy of populism. The legacy of Vargas in Brazil, the legacy of Perón in Argentina, the legacy to some degree of Arbenz in Guatemala, certainly the legacy of Baije in Uruguay. And again, I don't expect most people are familiar with Baije, the great Uruguayan leader, who was a Keynesian before Keynes, who brought unemployment insurance to Uruguay in 1914, the 8-hour day in 1915, and women's suffrage at the same time. José Baije Ordóñez. But in Uruguay, again, he is seen as the legitimator of popular reform, and that banner has been picked up by the Frente Amplio, in which includes the Tupamaros, which is another historic reference to Tupac Amaru, the great indigenous leader who fought one of the last great uprisings against the Spanish. So Latin America is littered with historical figures. What is Baijismo? In Uruguay, it is everything, and it underwrites the ability of the Frente Amplio to make social reforms in the spirit of Baije, and it also underwrites their ability to function as a neoliberal regime. So, because after all, Baije was not a socialist, he was not a communist, so again, and we'll get into some of those complexities. There's the legacy of a certain form of Bonapartism, which goes hand in hand with populism. Ultimately, Bonapartism is a great leader, a man on a horse, usually with a sword. And you see statues of these people everywhere. And really what it is what happens when the contending social classes, the bourgeoisie and the working class, are unable to arrive, either one of them, at a great victory. Neither one wins, so out of the middle comes this. It was classically in Latin America used to define the Mexican Revolution, where neither the masses nor the ruling class were able to win, and the generals ruled. And it again goes back to Bonaparte in France, who again, in the contending factions, the general came to the fore, the armed forces came to the fore. And in Latin America, we've seen Bonapartism of the left and the right. There was a whole period of time in the 1970s, 60s really, 70s and 80s, where American imperialism and South American neo-capitalism collaborated to use the army as their political party. and produced a series of military dictatorships. But there are also Bonapartists on the left, including a number of people who've come up through the military. Chavez is an example and formed there. In the Peruvian government today is another example of somebody who came out of the army. Ollanta Humala. So this legacy of Bonapartism is important, as is the legacy of populism in a number of these countries, as is the continuing impact of the Cuban Revolution, because there is one example. Which one doesn't look like the other ones? Cuba. Because in Cuba there was a successful socialist revolution. The Cuban Revolution is a shining example of the victory of a small country oppressed by a larger country that fought a battle and won. A battle for national independence that then became a battle for socialism. And that's something that's interesting. Of course, it was fought under yet another historical figure, José Martí. And that memory is still very much alive in Latin America, and it is part of the possibility for socialism that exists then. It was never wiped out, and part of that goes back to the legacy of the Cuban Revolution, that the Cubans got away with it. They proved that you could take power, that you could make a successful transition to a socialist economy and regime and get away with it. In other countries, you have other things, and again, it shows the contradiction. There's an old man, he's 77 years old, he drives an old car, a Volkswagen Beetle. It's worth $1,500 apparently. He gives 90% of his salary to charity. He's 77. He spent 15 of those years in prison. He was arrested 4 times and escaped from at least one prison. The last time he was arrested, they decided to put an end to this, and they put 6 bullets into him. Somehow, he survived. Part of his sentence was served in a well, a dry well, in solitary confinement. He's a vegetarian and he grows flowers as a hobby. He's also the president of Uruguay, José Mujica. But he is closer to his fellow guerrilla veteran, Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, than he would be to either Chavez or Morales in Bolivia or Correa in Ecuador or a number of other people. So if you want to say that you have this incredibly attractive figure, this old man, it's very nice, his face is a wonderful exercise. Mujica, the president of Uruguay, yet he is part of a regime which is essentially a neoliberal regime that governs, or a social liberal regime is a term that is increasingly used, that essentially applies the Washington Consensus, while he smiles and gives 90% of his salary to charity and raises his flowers and pets his dog. Manuela, in fact, is the name of the dog, as opposed to some of the veterans of the guerrilla struggle in places like Venezuela, who are far more active and have derived different conclusions from the defeat of those movements. So there is no uniform interpretation of memory in South America. Bolivar believed in that. He loved the American Revolution and the French Revolution. He had a little difference of opinion with the Americans. He was against slavery. That was big news in the early 19th century in Latin America. But he also had another difference of opinion with the American Revolution. He thought this democracy stuff was a bit iffy, and he didn't think Latin America was ready for it. So when you see some of the Bonapartist tendencies of a man like Hugo Chavez and some of the others, and their reticence, in a certain sense, they really are carrying on the tradition of Bolivar, which was progressive on the one hand, but some real resistance to democratic structures on another. And of course, if one wanted to make a critique of the Cuban Revolution, it would be that it too has maintained political power very close to the vest of a small number of people. And this is one of the struggles that are there today. Two ideas, one of which is a theory called permanent revolution. This theory was developed by Leon Trotsky, one of the great Marxists of the 20th century, and it was inspired by his interpretation of the Russian Revolution of 1905, when he said, the bourgeoisie can't make a bourgeois revolution. It'll have to be made by the working class, and then why would they make a bourgeois revolution? They will move on to socialism, and the tasks of the bourgeois revolution and socialist revolution will be telescoped. Okay? The other was a similar idea called combined and uneven development, where again, Trotsky looked at Russia and he said, well, here you have the most concentrated proletariat in all of Europe in these new factories that are springing up. And this working class, as he described them, they read in German the debates in the German Diet at lunch. And he said, and 5 miles away there are people who worship blocks of wood. You see some of those same qualities in South America. On the one hand, you have the internet and you have industrial development, it's particularly in mining and resource extraction, etc. And not only that, but also in factories, etc. And at the same time, you have peasants who are living, I don't know, in the 15th, the 16th, the 17th century. You have Aboriginal peoples who are trying to defend their lifestyle, who, in some extreme cases, essentially are living in prehistory. And what does this mean? How do you deal with this? What are the implications of this for popular movements? Marx wrote towards the end of his life that he perhaps had been wrong about Russia, that maybe Russia was going to be a beacon for socialism because of the possibility of building socialism on the basis of the peasant consciousness of the mir, of this kind of peasant commune. This was a real break with what was seen as Marxism at the time, and one of the reasons why Marx always denied that he was a Marxist, etc. And in Latin America it is the same. The communal consciousness of some of the Aboriginal societies there, and particularly in countries where they play a large role, like Bolivia, like Ecuador, to a lesser extent in some other places, is something that is important and has provided a basis for some of the mobilizations. That, coupled with the historical enmity between the people of those countries and the foreigners who have come and taken away their natural resources, etc. This is important stuff that is still there. The concept which has been raised again in Venezuela, particularly, resuscitating the idea propagated by Che Guevara of the new man, the new human being. And this is something that is now being used in Venezuela, this concept again. Thinking about socialism as more than an economic restructuring, as more than industrialism, but as creating new human beings. It had a totally different way of looking at the world. You would have to look in terms of Marxism at Trotsky to some degree and at Gramsci around civil society, around hegemony, around a whole bunch of things. But it is well worth revisiting some of those texts, in fact, to get a sense, because those are texts that are influencing thinkers in Venezuela today, in Bolivia today, and in other places. In a way, the ALBA, the attempt to create a new integrated structure, is matched by a series of other structures that are emerging. Telesur is one of them. There's a number of others. This whole concept of 21st century socialism socialism, which draws from some of the better influences of 19th century and 20th century socialism, but also draws some other influence. It's an odd kind of brew. And more than anything else, and this is what is key, and which distinguishes a number of countries, certainly in Venezuela, and also to some degree in Bolivia and some of the other countries, basing the transformation of society on mass mobilization. And that is something that is fundamental, and that is one of the great differences. I think that we can say that there are three different things going on in South America today. There's three groups of countries, and one of them is, and I'll start with the least interesting of them, and one of them is Colombia, which really is the kind of backward figure in this thing, and Peru to a certain degree, Paraguay, which has gone back and forth a little bit, and Chile, where the center coalition, center left is maybe too much to ask for, was replaced by a right-wing government, etc. And these are kind of classic neoliberal regimes, in my view. Then you have what I think the best term I've heard for this is social liberalism. These are regimes that believe in the Washington Consensus, but with a human face. Uruguay is a classical example of that. Essentially, you have a neoliberal economy, but progressive social reforms. The Uruguayans just voted to legalize marijuana because they think it's stupid to go chasing kids around for smoking a joint. And they think it lets the gangs in, etc. Certainly Brazil, where you have the Zero Hunger campaign, on the one hand, which is a big campaign on the part of the Workers' Party government of Lula and now Rousseff. Very good, taking millions of people out of hunger. And on the other hand, they're growing piles and piles of soy and everything else for biofuels, and McDonald's, and destroying the Amazon, and doing all these things. And again, a government that came out of a party that was established by the trade union movement, and now has as its figurehead a woman who was imprisoned for a number of years and tortured for being part of the guerrilla movement, and is Washington's the most powerful nation economically, and a very, very close friend of Washington in Brazil. This is a contradiction, but you have these regimes that are social liberal. In that sense, they are classic social democratic regimes of the right. Then you have these three regimes that are kind of interesting, and I would call them, I don't know, left regimes, proto-socialist regimes, something, radical regimes, and I think the jury is out. Certainly Venezuela is the leading one, Bolivia is the second, and Ecuador, with more contradictions, is the third. And these regimes talk about socialism. Much of this is based on oil and gas. Oil and gas, rules the world. I mean, if you happily the Venezuelans have an enormous amount of it. They're the world's 5th largest crude exporter, 1.7 million barrels a day in 2009, which is worth at current prices $62 billion a year. That's a lot of chump change. You can do things with that. It's given the Chavez regime, with their ownership of a majority of all the oil companies, the money to do some interesting things. In the aftermath of the 2002 abortive coup in Venezuela, which was crushed by a mass mobilization, the PDVSA, the state oil company, backed the anti-Chavez forces and launched a strike to bring the government down. This had worked in Chile when I lived there in the 70s. You can do that. However, $14 billion in lost production later, Chavez won, and he fired 18,000 workers, managers, administrators, professionals in the oil company. And the oil money all of a sudden began to be used for social programs. $6.9 billion a year on social programs. Misiones, they are called. Misión Ribas deals with adult education. Sucre with university scholarships. Guaycaipuro with indigenous land title transfer. And Milagro with free eye surgery for 300,000 Venezuelans and 300,000 Cubans in a joint program with Cuba. The biggest and the first of these, Barrio Adentro, traded 53,000 barrels of oil a day to Cuba for 20,000 Cuban doctors. And of course the Chavez government is accused of wasting the money, of throwing it away, of this and that, on stupid things like food and doctors and housing for people. Again, it's one of those things. In Bolivia, there's something similar. Evo Morales came to power on the basis of two things: his position as the leader of the coca farmers and the fact that he was one of the leaders of what was known as the gas war. The Chaco War in the 1930s, where Standard Oil fought Shell, with Bolivia fighting for Standard Oil and Shell being fought for by the Paraguayans, leaving tens of thousands of people dead, is one of the chapters in Latin American history that are glossed over often. Various governments of the popular left in Bolivia nationalized oil and gas. Various governments of the right sold them off again to North American, European, Brazilian, Argentine companies. There was a regime called the Goni regime. The president's name was Goni. He was better known as El Gringo. This is in the 1990s. Why El Gringo? Because he'd lived in the United States for so long that he spoke Spanish with an American accent. This was the president of Bolivia. He divided the oil and gas company into three and sold it off to companies like Enron and British Petroleum. Remember the Gulf spill. Royalties to the government were cut by 2/3, and the new owners ended up with $118 billion in assets for next to no money against future revenues. This is in a country with a gross domestic product of a little over $1,000 per person. They also had the idea of building a pipeline to export the gas through Chile. Now, Chile and Bolivia have a little problem that goes back a number of years called the War of the Pacific in 1879 to 1883, when the Chileans won and took Antofagasta, which was Bolivia's access to the sea. The Bolivians have never forgiven this, and they still maintain a navy on Lake Titicaca, just in case, or waiting for the day. This plan ushered in the gas war, where 10,000 people marched on Cochabamba. Cochabamba, some of you might remember, is where the water war took place, where there was a mass uprising against selling the water, privatizing the water company. So Evo Morales was part of that. Goni resigned. His vice president tried to prevent a referendum on renationalizing the oil and gas, was forced to resign, and Morales won the election. This has had enormous impact culturally in the pride of the indigenous people that make up the majority of Bolivia. The fact that the president can make a speech in Aymara. Ecuador, which is the last of these three countries I'm going to talk about, is a different kind of case. Once again, it's oil and mining also in Ecuador. In 1967, Texaco found oil near the Ecuador-Colombian border. For the next 25 years, they took out the oil and they left a mess. They left 19 billion gallons of waste and hundreds of millions of gallons of crude oil, enough to dwarf the Exxon Valdez, which made the news, but this didn't make the news. There was a lawsuit in 1993. It's still working its way through the courts, but this year, the government was awarded by an international court $6 billion from Chevron, who bought Texaco. The government wants $18 billion and has filed claims against Chevron's property in Brazil and also in Canada. So, on the one hand, this has made them very popular. On the other, I had this lovely thing that I found here where the Heritage Institute in the United States has this thing: Ecuador should forfeit U.S. trade preferences. Right, James Roberts in August of 2012. Recently, Ecuador opened a new chapter in its long-running legal campaign against U.S.-based Chevron Corporation, government-backed lawyers purporting to represent, I love that, residents of Ecuador's Amazon rainforest filed a lawsuit to seize Chevron's assets in Brazil in an attempt to collect a multi-billion-dollar award won last year in the Ecuadorian court. Regrettably, the Chevron case is one of many recent examples of the destructive anti-free market and anti-democracy policies being pursued by Ecuador's President Rafael Correa, etc., etc., and it goes on. But Correa wants oil extraction, and he also wants mining. And this is part of the problem, because a number of the Aboriginal peoples and peasants who live there don't want any of this shit. They're not interested that the money goes to the government. What they're interested in is in their land, and they have a march that they organize called March for Life, Water, and the Dignity of Peoples. And it was an anti-government march in Ecuador. And the government mobilized its forces against this march. But the anti-government march was bigger than the government march. The demands of the anti-government march, there were 19 of them: opposition to the extension of the oil frontier, i.e. where it can be taken out, agrarian reform, respect for labor rights, rejection of free trade agreements, respect for the exercise of sexual and reproductive rights, and opposition to social criminalization, among others. The key element was the defense of water in opposition to mega mining. The Correa government has found itself, to some degree, this has also been true in Bolivia, caught between wanting to do business on the one hand, and on the other hand, having a popular mobilization that does not want to do business, that is more interested in maintaining their traditions, maintaining their land, etc. So it remains to be seen where things are going to go in Ecuador. Despite the Bolivarian rhetoric, despite bits and pieces of socialist rhetoric, the same thing is true in all these countries. I think it's impossible to predict the future. But I think what is going on there is extremely exciting. But what is going on there is extremely contentious. And I think that's true. The reason, I think fundamentally what we are seeing is a battle between, in most of these countries, and I'm going to end here, between right-wing and left-wing social democracy. In that, despite the socialist rhetoric, I think fundamentally at this point it's very difficult to see anybody that wants to get rid of capitalism, despite what is said here or there. I think more or less, and believe me, I have nothing against left social democracy when the alternative is total neoliberalism. But I think that it's really, both the regimes and the popular movements are trying to figure out how far they can go, what they can do, etc.
Gary Cristall explains very clearly the tensions between the Social Democrats accommodating neoliberal policies on the one hand, and the democratic socialists on the other hand, who are testing or figuring out how far they can go to replace capitalism. He concludes by saying that so far no regime of any state is directly advocating for the abolition of capital. Perpetual Direct Democracy, this little booklet published by Amazon.com, expands on that concrete utopia of a moneyless society. In other words, a social system that does not depend on capital. You can also read this Perpetual Direct Democracy booklet on pacific.ca. I am Pedro Mora.